Video game literacy, Allegory, and Metroid Fusion. Metroid Fusion is the first of the Metroid quadrilogy to be released after my birth. I played it on the original GBA. It was also one of the first games I ever purchased myself, using my allowance, of course. I still remember how it jumped out at me in the middle of the two game racks at Toys R Us. I definitely judged this book by its cover art, and I'm glad I did, because it did not disappoint. Fusion begins with a cinematic. First, there is a lovely yellow planet. Then, Samus and some mechs enter a room, and... murder an animal? Disclaimer, no animals were harmed in the making of this video. The animal disintegrates, leaving behind only its yellow soul, which Samus collects as a trophy of her kill. Then, she's flying in her spaceship next to a dump truck labeled BSL for Bull Ship Lies. Wait a minute. Lie is a chemical. We can't just go around pluralizing it by adding an S afterwards. There's gotta be rules, you know. So let's try again. Let's be proper about this. Bottles of lie. Bottle, ship, lie. Wait a minute. Bottle ship is a lie? Well, Half-Life 3 confirmed. Samus then gets really, really angry. And I mean really, really angry. Her ship warns her that an asteroid belt is near, and she can think of no better way to quell her rage than to take it out on an asteroid. So she sets a collision course. Her ship explodes in a glorious fireball. When she wakes up, she's about to be probed by two aliens. Fortunately, they are nothing if not professional doctors. So they sterilize her body with PI. That is, povidone iodine. You know, the yellowish brown stuff that doctors apply to skin to sterilize it? What did you think I meant by PI? So anyway, the aliens sterilize her body before continuing with the operation. She then lays on a surgical table for a long time whilst she's getting probed. A long, long time. A long, long, long time. Suddenly, a hand flashes a vial of pure radioactive waste, seemingly threatening Samus that if she doesn't cooperate with the probing, they are going to... Oh, it's a vaccine? And it has something to do with a Metroid? Wait, there's some kind of double helix off on the right side of the screen there. Oh, I think I know what this is. This is that vaccine I've been hearing so much about lately, but never actually seeing. Yeah. The one that totally, 100%, definitely modifies your DNA when you get it. I know this is obviously not false, because I've been told it by certifiably expert mediciners whose main credential is having completed a high school biology course decades ago. Unfortunately, the PI seems to have got into Samus's head a little bit and is corrupting her entire brain. Who knows what it's doing to her mind? It's making her so crazy that she's starting to question the alien probing. Maybe she should have been treated with the same respect as any other person and only been operated on when she asked for it. Maybe all those times people asked her if she was getting the operation shouldn't have really happened. After all, shouldn't the decision to be probed or not to be probed by an alien be between Samus and her doctor? And isn't she still Samus, whether or not she ultimately decides to get the probing? Nah, that's just her newly arrived sense of self-worth speaking. Fortunately, we have a vaccine for that. It instantly got rid of that nasty PI, and she's back to being alienated by her body. Yay! Only now, it's blue instead of yellow. And now she's back on her ship as if none of it ever happened. And everybody except Samus lived happily ever after. The end. Wait a minute. There's text in this cutscene? Did I seriously forget to turn off fit to width and it cut off all the text? Oh no. Well, let's give it a watch through with the text and see just how closely I was able to interpret the so-called visual storytelling. Fusion begins with a cinematic of Samus flying through space after an excursion on planet SR-388. Unbeknownst to her, she had suffered biological harm. She suddenly begins losing consciousness, and her ship, without her to command it, begins drifting into an asteroid. Before it explodes, a safety mechanism ejects her into an escape pod. The escape pod is later rescued by the Federation, whose scientists immediately begin to diagnose her. While on planet SR-388, she had become infected with a dangerous parasite that was sure to claim her life if they didn't act now. Much of her suit's biological components had been thoroughly infected, so the doctors had to surgically amputate it, carving out sections at a time. Samus's immune system was unable to fight the parasite on its own, so, in a last-ditch effort, the scientists decided to concoct an experimental vaccine out of a Metroid, whose species was the natural predator of the parasite. The vaccine does its job, but it comes at a cost. Samus has acquired the Metroid's extreme vulnerability to cold, and she has lost nearly all of her suit's powers from the surgery. Her life isn't so much saved as it is transformed. The old Samus doesn't really exist anymore, but part of that past lives on in the Frankenstein's monster she has become. And through it all, she faces the somber reality that this Metroid has saved her twice. And all she ever did for it was... well, we'll save that for later. So, how did I do with guessing the story only from the visuals? Not that great? Weird. It's almost as though there are some stories which are complex enough that, unless you're Charlie Chaplin, you actually need to use words to describe. What a novel concept. And the story is better for it too, because I don't know about you, but the version of the story I interpreted is a bunch of self-righteous BSL. If this cutscene, or even my second description of it, didn't capture your attention at least a little, I would be very surprised. It's a textbook example of how to write a compelling intro that seamlessly integrates previous entries in the series with what is to come. A core feature of Metroid games is collecting power-ups as you progress. This is something that the player normally needs to suspend their disbelief over. After all, Samus has collected all the power-ups in Metroid 1, why would she need to collect them all again in Metroids 2 and 3? But Metroid 4 doesn't even need the player to suspend their disbelief. Samus lost her powers because her power suit was surgically removed to save her life. Her initial weakness is not just a necessary evil to recreate series standard gameplay, it's actually plot-driven. Creating plot to fit the audience expected gameplay is a seemingly minor thing, and when done poorly, it can actually end up worse than just asking the player to suspend their disbelief in the first place. But Fusion pulls it off in spades. The stakes are so high for moment 1 that it's easy to not even notice that Samus's power suit getting removed is an expedient to justify the subsequent power-up collecting. The fact she would literally be lying on her deathbed if her suit were not removed obfuscates it by the power of sheer intensity. Even as some things get resolved quickly, like Samus's crash, they are rapidly replaced by even more dire revelations. Samus is in a race against time with a rapidly reproducing deadly parasite. She's in a very weakened state from the surgery and the vaccine, and must build her strength by downloading suit upgrades before the parasite takes over the entire research station. And, in typical Metroid fashion, she must do it alone. These surface-level considerations are all well and good, but there's a little-known yet very important secret that has massive implications for Metroid Fusion's rhetoric. Are you ready? Sheik is a girl. I mean, Samus is a girl. Okay, I got them confused, alright? They're both Nintendo characters who were once thought to be men, who were later revealed to be women, and their names start with S. You gotta cut me some slack here, okay? Wait, you already knew that? What do you mean we're not in 1986 anymore, Toto? Alright, fine. Well, here's another thing about Samus you may not have known. Samus is transgender. Some of you may have already caught on to this by the allusions I've already made, or the references the game itself makes. Others may cry foul. After all, there isn't a single Metroid game that says the words, Samus is transgender. How else could we possibly know this? Well, part of the answer lies in your thinking on the death of the author philosophy. I strongly recommend you watch Lindsay Ellis's video on this topic, because she does a far better job investigating it than I ever could. So I'll link it in the description below. For the purposes of continuing to talk about it though, I will provide a high-level overview. Essentially, death of the author is the idea that media exists independently from its creators. It doesn't matter what the authors of a work say about it if they didn't say so in the work itself. Now, if you go ahead and peruse Samus's page in the Metroid Wiki, and you scroll down to the part where it says gender, you may find that the 1994 release of the Nintendo official guidebook for Super Metroid contained an interview with one of Samus's designers, Hirofumi Matsuoka. In the interview, he was asked if there's anything about Samus that only he knew. And his response was, Samus isn't a woman. As a matter of fact, she's actually a new half. New half is a Japanese slang term for transgender women, roughly equivalent to some English slurs for the group that I won't bear repeating. And if you read a little further, you can see that this was retconned in 2004 by series co-creator Yoshio Sakamoto in a remark, and also somewhat in the game that came out that year, Zero Mission. But here's the thing. Metroid Fusion came out in 2002. Any decision the creators made in 2002 or earlier is still present in the final game. It's a snapshot in time from before the retcon. And let me tell you, this game is positively dripping with trans allegory. Before continuing any further, there's something I want to say. At this point, I imagine I've driven away a lot of folks by continuing to talk about Metroid Fusion for so long, when it's perhaps the most hated game in the series, and not having a single negative word to say about it. So I'm hopeful that if I were to put a personal touch on this video, it isn't going to drive anybody else away. So here we go. I am transgender. Metroid Fusion means an enormous amount to me because of the accuracy and poignancy with which it speaks to my experiences through a masterfully crafted allegory. And I feel like I would do the game a disservice without talking about it. So let's talk about it. If you take a look at Encyclopedia Britannica, which currently is driving me insane because it keeps going to a black background, you'll find that allegory is the symbolic fictional narrative that conveys a meaning not explicitly set forth in the narrative. Allegory, which encompasses forms such as fable, parable, apologue, may have meaning on two or more levels that the reader can only understand through an interpretive process. See also fable, parable, and allegory. Now, if we go to literarydevices.net and check out their page on allegory, we will find that allegory is a narration or description in which events, actions, characters, settings, or objects represent specific abstractions or ideas. Allegory generally operates on two levels as a literary device. The overt or surface narrative / description is meant to have enough literary elements to be a standalone work that is interesting and or entertaining by itself. However, the emphasis of allegory is typically placed on the abstract ideals represented or symbolized by the work's literary elements. In other words, the meaning behind the surface narrative has an even greater value as a literary work. Though many allegories are intended to be didactic in providing a moral, ethical, or religious lesson, not all allegories set out to achieve this goal. And then if we look at literarydevices.com's definition, which somehow that's an entirely different website, we can find that an allegory is a work of art, such as a story or a painting, in which the characters, images, and or events act as symbols. The symbolism in an allegory can be interpreted to have a deeper meaning. An author may use allegory to illustrate a moral or spiritual truth, or historical or political situation. Allegories can be understood to be a type of extended metaphor. An extended metaphor develops a certain analogy to a greater extent than a simple comparison. An allegory, meanwhile, uses a particular metaphor throughout an entire plot. The word allegory comes from the ancient Greek for to speak so as to imply something other. The definition of allegory makes sense coming from this term, as an allegory always has some hidden meaning below the surface. I provided all three definitions here for diversity of perspective. Each hones in on a different part of what makes an allegory. The Britannica definition, which again is driving me insane because it keeps having a black background, it focuses on how the second meaning can only be understood through an interpretive process. This is an extremely important point for us going forward because nowhere in Fusion does it ever say anything explicit about being trans. What it says about being trans can only be uncovered through interpretation. The .NET definition focuses on how a surface narrative is itself a standalone work that is designed to be interesting, even without considering the second interpreted meaning. Fusion can be thoroughly enjoyed purely for what it is on the surface level. A story about a bounty hunter working to save the universe from a deadly virus. Interpreting the second meaning is purely extra enjoyment one can get out of it. In a sense, it's entirely optional. The .com definition focuses on how the work uses the same metaphor throughout an entire plot. Fusion does this. There is simply no other pervasive metaphor throughout the whole game than the trans one. Furthermore, the Greek etymology included with this definition, to speak so as to imply something other, is a beautiful and to-the-point way to summarize allegory. To speak so as to imply something other. I don't know about you, but that sounds kind of like black magic to me. How could I possibly be saying one thing, but be meaning something entirely different? Well, let me illustrate it with an example. Say we had a monkey and a seal who decided they wanted to run a race. Now, I don't know about you, but my money's on the monkey. Look at this guy. He's got arms, he's got legs. I bet he could run really, really fast. But the thing is, the monkey ran so fast that he actually tired himself out and he needed to rest on the side of the racetrack for a nap. And all the meanwhile, the seal, which had just been bouncing along, seals can't walk on their fins, so it's just slowly bouncing along down the racetrack, and eventually it passes the monkey. And it actually crosses the finish line before the monkey even wakes up. Now, some of you may recognize this story as a slightly modified version of Aesop's fable, The Tortoise and the Hare. It was just modified because I didn't have a tortoise and a hare stuffed animal, so I had to make do with what I got. But anyway, This fable is very famous. I would be surprised if many of you watching this video at all had never heard about it before. But the thing is that fable, it's not really about a tortoise, a hare, or even a race. It's pretty obvious that tortoises and hares don't run races, right? So there is no literal value to the story, and as far as the story goes, that's just meant to be purely entertaining. I don't know. This one's kind of short. I don't find it like incredibly entertaining on its own. So there's some other purpose to the tortoise and the hare. And the purpose is in the second narrative, the one that lies beneath the surface. The tortoise and the hare is actually a story of perseverance. It's a story of how some people, by the mere circumstances of their birth, are placed on a higher run of society than others. It's a story about how those who are placed on that lower run, they have to struggle for survival. There simply is no taking a vacation. You can't escape your external image and stigma. So when those folks finally overcome it, it has so much more meaning in a way that the people on the higher runs of society could never really experience themselves. There's a sense of happiness, peace, bliss, satisfaction, and, well, pride that simply wouldn't be experienceable any other way. And this is the power of allegory. If you think about it, if I told the story this way to begin with, I don't think many of you would have continued to listen. I don't think it would have been something that was interesting to you. In fact, it might have even been something that was somewhat offensive. But this is what's great about it, because the surface narrative is very basic, and it just can kind of float around in the back of your mind for a long time. It doesn't really take up much space in your brain, and it doesn't really make you think that hard. But much later, sometimes decades later, it can come to the surface, and you can realize what that second narrative was the whole time. And this is exactly what happened for me with Metroid Fusion. I've always loved this game's story, but I took it at surface level. I took it at face value. I didn't realize until 19, but basically 20 years after the game's release, that there's a second story underneath. All right, so we hopefully understand Allegory a little bit better now. Let's explain the trans allegory in Metroid Fusion. The intro does a lot of heavy lifting here. I alluded to some of what's going on in the intro through my first interpretation of it that did not use the text, but I deliberately did so in a rather obtuse, insider-joking way. Let's examine it again in a more explicit context. Samus's body being killed from the inside out by the X-parasites is a metaphor for the experience of being a trans person pre-transition. It could be interpreted somewhat more literally, with the parasites being the incorrect hormone your body is producing and the effects that has on your mental health, as you watch the vision of what your body should be slowly dying before your very eyes. Alternatively, it could be somewhat more abstract and be about the experience of conflict between one's inner self and the way the world sees them. It can also be both things. Similarly, removing the infected pieces of Samus's power suit is a pretty direct metaphor for giving gender-affirming surgery. Indirectly, it's a metaphor about how, over the process of transitioning, one's outside begins to match one's inside for the very first time. The Metroid Vaccine, again, is a direct metaphor for hormone replacement therapy. The vaccine eradicates the virus from Samus's system, much in the same way taking a testosterone blocker does to testosterone. Both the surgery and the vaccine make Samus weaker. She has lost all her power suit upgrades, and she is extremely vulnerable to cold. This, again, is a pretty direct metaphor for the process of medically transitioning from male to female. Let me preface this by saying there are plenty of women who are physically stronger than most men. For instance, female athletes versus males living sedentary lifestyles. But when you compare men and women, or more accurately, those with high and low levels of testosterone at the same athletic level, those with higher levels of testosterone generally can achieve faster times or heavier lifts, assuming all else is equal, and that's a big assumption because it usually isn't. This even affects cis women. A cis woman is a woman who was assigned female at birth, aka not a trans woman. Cis women with higher than average levels of testosterone are often forbidden from playing on women's teams unless they take what essentially amounts to feminizing hormone replacement therapy, even though they are cis. I'm going to include links to some articles about this in the description. So, in taking feminizing hormone therapy and also recovering from a major surgery, Samus is physically weakened and must take time to build back up her strength. Anecdotally, this personally affected me in a couple ways as well. I love cooking, and one of the things I noticed after being on HRT a while is that when I was lifting a pot of water from the sink over to the stove, it felt a little heavier. I could still do it, no problem. I can lift pots of water over the sink. That's not hard, but yeah, it just felt a little bit heavier. And then the other example I wanted to give is that for my job, I sometimes have to lift 80 pounds. And before HRT, I was able to do that, no problem. And after HRT, I can still do that, no problem. But it just feels like it's sort of at the limit of my strength now. Whereas before, I didn't really feel like I was hitting that cap yet with only 80 pounds. So I just sort of wanted to give these personal examples because I wanted to clarify that this effect, this reduction of physical strength, is really not as big a deal as everyone makes it. It exists, but it's a really minor thing. It sort of just makes things feel heavier. It doesn't mean women can't do things that men can, you know? The penultimate part of the intro is the idea that Samus isn't entirely human anymore. She's mostly human, but she's part Metroid, as evidenced by her extreme vulnerability to cold. This is a metaphor for the othering trans people experience, largely by society, but also at times by ourselves. It's easy to worry that we are just too different from cis people to really fit in. Even though we are still human and thus are more similar to our fellow people than we are different, sometimes the differences are easy to overemphasize. And of course, many of these feelings of self-doubt that can sometimes occur are directly instigated by the societal conditions in which we live and were raised. We are told by the media and all too often by family and friends that people like us are unacceptable, freaks, or worse. It's all but impossible to not internalize these messages, even if we later find positive media representations that counteract these ideas. And finally, Samus ponders that the Metroid has saved her life. Twice. This is made all the more poignant by what she has done to it. Fair warning, this contains major Metroid II and Super Metroid spoilers, so I'm going to include a link in the description to get past the Metroid II spoilers. I can't really include one for the Super Metroid spoilers because the whole rest of it sort of relies on it, so I hope you've played or at least watched the ending of Super Metroid. Anyway, let's continue. So, in Metroid II, Samus exterminated the entire Metroid species except for one individual. In Super Metroid, this Metroid shielded her from Mother Brain's attack, dying in the process. Imagine what a somber realization that must be. You've killed not only someone's family, but their entire species. And they willingly give their life for you. And even after they are already dead, you receive some sort of biological transplant from their body, saving your life a second time. This is an extremely heavy topic for a game, especially a Nintendo game, to cover, and it almost puts me at a loss for words. The Metroid is a metaphor for transitioning. For many of us, it simply came to a point where we could not continue to live without transitioning. It was quite literally adapt or die, much as one would picture natural selection. And because of two key moments, namely the Metroid blocking Mother Brain's attack and the vaccine made from cells of its dead body, Samus was able to adapt and thus continue to live. I, too, had two key moments that enabled me to transition. The first is when my choir teacher in high school worked so hard to get me to join choir. A little bit of background here, I've always detested my voice. And it just was really emotionally painful for me because even guys could make their voices higher than I could make mine. You know, if you go to a sports match and you're cheering in a high-pitched voice, I couldn't even do that, all right? I had such little control over my voice. And my choir teacher in high school, bless his heart, he worked really hard that even in face of my heavy, heavy resistance to get me to audition for him. And when I did, and after I finished, and I started sort of talking down on myself about how horrible I was, my choir teacher says, you know, you're not actually that bad. And I bet anything you're not happy about your voice, you can easily learn just by singing with other people. And that, for me, was so powerful. It's honestly kind of hard for me to not cry when I talk about my choir teacher because he just made the biggest difference in my life, more than anybody ever has, and it's just such an emotional topic for me. And the other moment for me was when I was later in college, I had psychologists and a doctor who, unlike the experiences of most trans people, were actually very hands-off and sort of allowed me to take my transition at my own pace. When I told them I was ready to try HRT, they just sort of backed off and filled out all the paperwork that needed to be filled out and just let me. They didn't try to gatekeep me, which, again, is really a huge thing, and it's not something every trans person has the pleasure of being able to say, which is pretty unfortunate. So there's one more thing that I want to talk about besides the intro. The intro does a lot of the heavy lifting, but there's really just one more thing in this game that is really powerful for this allegory, and that is the sax. The sax, or Samus Aran X, was formed from the infected pieces of Samus's power suit that had been surgically removed. The parasite continued to grow and multiply inside. Eventually, it had become strong enough that it was able to completely commandeer the suit of armor, gaining all of Samus's latent powers, but without a shred of her humanity. Its only goal was its own survival, happy to kill anything that got in its way to do so. The sax represents the shell of a person Samus's former self was. It looks like her, but wasn't her. It had no capacity for emotion or empathy. Throughout Fusion, Samus has many encounters with the sax. At first, the sax is far more powerful. It is something to be feared, and with good reason. It can kill Samus in only a couple of hits. All Samus can do is hide, run away, and try to dodge its ice beam shots. Nothing in her arsenal does a lick of damage to the sax. As Samus progresses, she eventually gains the plasma beam, which can penetrate the sax, ice missiles, which can freeze it, and a whole lot of energy tanks to allow her to survive more than a few ice beam shots. At this point, she is finally ready to take on the sax. They have an intense final battle, but eventually Samus is able to get the upper hand. The sax manages to escape. The process of powering up signifies Samus coming to terms with her former self. Time heals all wounds, and eventually Samus is strong enough to not let her past rule her. Her regrets and opportunities lost during the pre-transition part of her life finally start to pale in comparison to who she is right now. One of the things that I want to relate to with my own experience is that when I was young, one of the things I hated most about what I was is that it meant I wasn't able to have sleepovers with my friends because it was too inappropriate. At the time, this was pretty catastrophic to me, but the older I got, and the further I got into my transition, the less it actually mattered. Right as Samus is about to board the ship to evacuate the research station, she is attacked by an Omega Metroid. She's no match for it without her Ice Beam, which is a Metroid's only weakness, and it quickly gets the best of her. While she's contemplating the end of her own life, she suddenly hears a familiar sound. Someone is shooting an Ice Beam. She looks up and sees that the Sax has returned and is attacking the Omega Metroid. It manages to severely weaken the Metroid before it too is gotten the better of it. This time, however, the Sax is unable to escape, and it disintegrates into merely the constituent X. Samus absorbs the X and recovers her final latent ability, the Ice Beam. This should not be possible. Her Metroid body chemistry should reject it. But somehow fate has smiled upon her, and with the absorption, she is no longer part Metroid. With the panacea of the Ice Beam, Samus makes quick work of the Omega and leaves the BSL station one last time. This moment is incredibly symbolic. The implication here is that the Sax was only fighting alongside Samus because it saw a pure Metroid as a greater threat to its own safety than Samus herself, who is only part Metroid. The Omega Metroid represents all the other struggles Samus will face in her life. What Samus was, dies, and tacitly agrees to do so, fighting alongside her instead of against her, realizing it's in its own best interest to stop fighting with its present incarnation and start fighting the external struggles, such as society's disapproval of Samus, whether pre or post-transition. The two then become one, her past and her present, and they live inside her in harmony, with her present fully in control and her past a mere memory along for the ride. At this point, not only has Samus overcome her past, but her past has learned to accept her too. She's finally whole in a way she has never been before, and is ready to start her life over. Hello. Anybody who has stuck through the video all the way to the end, I sincerely thank you. Metroid Fusion means an enormous amount to me, more than any other video game, or even any piece of media in general. A lot of people really dislike Fusion, and even the ones who like it likely didn't see the same second story underneath the main story that I did. I really want to share my love of this game with the world and explain why I love it so much. And those of you who are still here really listened to what I had to say, and for that, I'm extremely grateful. I do want to tie up a couple of loose ends about this video by doing a Q&A based on questions that I think are likely to come up. So let's start with the first question. Did the developers really intend Metroid Fusion to be a trans allegory? Honestly, that's a question that's all but impossible to know for anyone who wasn't in the boardroom during the development of the game. And in my opinion, it doesn't really matter too much. It matters so much more what the game is than how it got to be that way. To attempt to answer your question though, I'll say this. Metroid Fusion speaks to my experiences of being trans in a way no other piece of media has ever done. As far as I'm concerned, it's as perfect a trans allegory as one could possibly make, and certainly better than one I can make myself. I find it to be somewhat unlikely that such a true masterpiece can be attained purely by the winds of chance. I personally think that at least parts of the allegory were intended by at least one person involved in the development of the game. And even if they weren't, even if it was just pure chance, that makes it all the more beautiful. Question 2. Isn't this a Japanese game? Your personal experiences of being trans in the West surely look much different than for a trans person living in Japan. This is also very true. I know almost nothing about Japanese culture, and as such, I really have no idea what it's like being trans in Japan. But one thing I will say is that trans people have existed across all cultures since the beginning of recorded history. Just as Samus being part Metroid makes it easy to ignore all her similarities with other humans, surely the broad strokes of the trans experience must have some common threads, even if the specifics look very different between individuals and across cultures. Question 3. This video's analysis is very subjective. How am I supposed to believe that the allegory is about being trans, or that there is even an allegory at all? Uncovering allegory necessarily requires interpretation of the base media, to the point that it was even in one of the first 3 hits for allegory definition I found on a search engine. Interpretation is inherently somewhat subjective, even more so when it comes to the interpretation of art. In some ways, it comes down to the old adage, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. If you interpret Fusion against your own life experiences in a different way than me, I would love to hear it. That said, one of the conditions for allegory is that it's a single metaphor persistent throughout the entire work. I predict that most other possible interpretations would fail that test, and the others that succeed would be less specific. The trans allegory is present from the intro to the very end of the game, and it's pervasive and on the nose throughout. That, coupled with the fact that the public statement from the developers until 2004 was that Samus is trans, makes me believe that the trans allegory hypothesis is even more likely. Appendix B, notes from the author. To bring this video to a close, I just wanted to offer an apology. I'm sorry for making this video, or at the very least, uploading it on this channel. My channel thus far has been pretty exclusively a home for Majora's Mask speedrunning content, mostly glitch related, but sometimes actual speedruns as well, and this is a pretty deep video. It's a video essay, I've never done one before, and it's about a game that I've never even featured on this channel. So it probably comes as something of a shock to see this video here, and I just want to apologize for how that may make you feel. But on the other hand, I also really wanted to thank those of you who have stuck with me for this long. Metroid Fusion means so much to me as a game. This video actually started as a look at the whole Metroid series, Metroids 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I got like 7 pages into the script and hadn't talked about any other game besides Metroid Fusion. And I knew I needed to split the video off at that point. I still do want to make the video about the entire Metroid series, but for now, this was a lot more important. And yeah, Metroid Fusion means an enormous amount to me. This little game right here means so much, and if it isn't obvious already, I just really don't know how else I can say it. So I really hope that you will get something out of this video. Whether that's a newfound appreciation for Metroid Fusion, maybe you didn't like the game before and now you're going to give it a second chance and maybe have a better opinion of it. That's a really big deal, and that means a lot to me. Maybe you've already loved this game, but you just had never seen the second story before, and maybe that second story means a lot to you, and that is also a really big deal. And perhaps the best thing that could possibly come of this video is if I change your mind on trans people. If that happens, I am just so incredibly grateful. Trans people have a history of being discriminated against, and a lot of times, not always, but sometimes that's just out of a lack of education. And I hope that through the making of this video, talking about the trans allegory in Metroid Fusion and sharing some of my own life experiences, I've humanized trans people in a way that makes them less of an other and something to be angry at, and more just another human trying to survive on this rock barreling through space. So anyway, that's pretty much everything I wanted to say. If you want to try out this game, it's available on the Wii U Virtual Console eShop for $8. And if you wanted an original cart like this, you can go on eBay for like 40 or $50, but you will need a GBA or a Nintendo DS or a Game Boy player to play it on. Um, but anyway, now that we have our game, let's play.